Thanks to James Wickham and Sylvia from TASC for asking me along here today. I have a set series of presentations that I give at various gigs, and James set me a challenge to talk about inequality, and that's why I have to go off and write one fresh and brand new and learn a lot in the meantime. I'm not an expert on labour. I know a lot more about inequality now than I did a week ago, but I do know a fair bit about housing, and when you put the three together, we come up with some very interesting things. So what I wanted to get from people, or what we're looking at here, the traditional aspiration, whether you like it or not, the traditional aspiration in Ireland, particularly for people buying their first homes, is something like on the left or the right there. Your 3-bed, semi-detached house, usually typically in a housing estate, and suburbia somewhere, and that's what a lot of people have aspired to for the last 4 or 5 decades in Ireland. Nothing wrong with it in many respects. Dave probably wouldn't agree with the transport implications of low density suburbia, but this is what we have, and that's all fine in many shapes and forms. This kind of stuff is absolutely fine. Increasingly, we're looking like the reality is going to be for a large cohort of people renting for a long time in substandard accommodation, often because the rental sector is pretty unregulated and does what it wants. So what I want to take away, or what really at the end of this presentation, I don't really have a huge amount of answers, but what I want people to take away from this is how can we mitigate the worst excesses of what might potentially be coming down the line for a whole generation of people, probably a generation behind me, and how can we work to ensure that it doesn't happen. It's already beginning to happen, but how can we work to ensure that it doesn't happen to a degree that it causes a large degree of harm. And thankfully, a lot of the speakers this morning, a lot of what they were saying has kind of reinforced, or in my own mind anyway, some of the things that I see happening out there. Now, traditionally, our labour market has a huge impact on our housing system, on how we house ourselves, and you can see that when there are decades of traditional, permanent, long-term pensionable employment, you tend to have steady and high rates of home ownership. That's kind of changing. So in a traditional form of work and housing, you put the two together and we have fairly predictable outcomes in terms of home ownership, in terms of the private rental sector, and in social housing. And we know what kind of people with what kind of employment go into each one of those categories. The world is changing rapidly, as we heard this morning from lots of people, including the lady from SIP2 there. And we have new forms of work out there, new ways of doing work. And there's also a new housing reality. I think housing post this austerity is not going to be the same as housing pre this austerity. And organisations like the CIF and that need to get their head around the fact that delivering housing is going to be a different game than it was maybe 15 or 20 years ago. The problem is that these new realities of work and housing are leading to uncertain outcomes in our traditional forms of home ownership, what's in the private rental sector, who goes into social housing, and do we have or do we need other categories, other types of housing? And there was a lot of talk earlier on about affordable housing, and that's pretty much where we're going. We have no notion of affordable housing in Ireland, really, and there is no plan for it, particularly on the home ownership front. So I just want to talk to you about what the reality is in the housing system, and then we'll marry it with some of the realities, I suppose, in terms of the new forms of work, and see what the outcomes will be. Home ownership has been declining steadily for the last 10 or 15 years. We're now at rates last seen in 1971, a fantastic year, of about 67.6%. And that isn't unusual. And the more countries become urbanised, you will find that levels of home ownership also decline commensurately. So as Ireland has becoming urbanised since 1966, and you'll see that has political implications for parties as well. But you'll find that as countries become urbanised, home ownership goes down. The top line there, which I realise is quite faint, but there's a large difference between rural areas and urban areas, and you can see the urban line that's at the bottom one there, where home ownership is, declining below 60% now in Dublin and places like that, whereas in rural areas it's still above 80%. That's due to access to land and affordability and cheaper prices and things like that. But the more urban a country becomes, and we are rapidly urbanising, and it's not going to stop, the lower the levels of home ownership. Same in America, where you're looking at rates in around 65%. Bloomberg Research in the US have calculated that the ideal level of home ownership for a country in terms of social mobility, labour mobility, affordability is 64%. Now that has a lot of other implications, but so we're not alone in terms of home ownership rates declining. Our friends in Spain, Italy, the UK, France, the UK and Germany have all seen declining rates of home ownership. It's not unusual. Our home ownership rate about 67.5%. The only country that's seeing an upswing in it is France. Whatever's going on in France, I don't know. The private rental sector within that. There's nearly 500,000 households in the private rental sector, including local authority housing. The private rental sector itself, excluding local authority housing, is 356,000 households there, and that's up about 10% from the last census, and it's up 45% from 10 years ago. That is a huge economic, social and cultural change. So when I go back to saying new forms of housing, new forms of work, the people that we would think of in the private rental sector, for example, students, immigrants, unemployed, all that kind of stuff, separated fathers typically, you see all that in the private rental sector now, but you also see surgeons, accountants, teachers, army officers, a whole lot in there. A whole different category of people who would traditionally have bought their own homes are now renting for lots of different reasons, but it's housing a lot more different types of people. I think that rate that we have of home ownership is actually too high. I think there's underreporting of the amount of people in the private rental sector for lots of reasons, partly to do maybe with overcrowding and not really wanting to admit on a census form how many people are living in accommodation. I think that's a big issue. And the methodology that we use to count home ownership, I think there could be an anomaly in that. The UK have found an anomaly in their system for counting home ownership, which brings their rate down considerably. And I've asked the CSO here, do we use the same methodology? And they said yes. So I think the rate that we have of 21 or 22% in the private rental sector, I think is probably underestimating the amount of people who are renting. In cities like Galway, about 42% of households rent. In Dublin, you're looking at about 32% of households renting. So it is a significant component. And it's not people renting between university and getting a proper job. It's people with serious jobs renting for a long time. And then we have the cry of the media, or the property media out there, saying the landlords are fleeing the market. Absolutely, they are. In the last 18 months, 6,000 landlords left being a landlord. On the other hand, what they won't tell you is that another 11,000 piled in. So the numbers of landlords in Ireland is up 5,000 in the last 18 months. So we now have 177,000 landlords registered in the country. 14% of new accommodation, mostly apartments, are being bought by investors. And why wouldn't they? If you have a guaranteed upward-only rent review of 4% per annum in a rent pressure zone, that's a good return, much better than putting your money in a bank. So, and you need landlords. I often get accused of being an anti-landlord. I am not anti-landlord nor anti-developer. I am pro-standards, but we need all sorts of people in the property sector. In terms of social housing then, number of local authority tenants are up 11%. I can't see that declining in the near future in any way, shape or form. So we've had 143,000 households last year being housed by local authorities and AHBs and that. And that's a significant... Can I just say something else about the PRS? One of the things on the census form that causes confusion now is the HAP payment. And I think there was confusion on the census form between, are you a public tenant, is your rent paid by a local authority, or are you in the private rental sector? And if you're actually in the private rental sector, but there was no space for if you're in the private rental sector, but your rent is being paid by a local authority, which box do you tick? And I think that's probably an issue there as well. Anyway, the numbers are rising, and like the private rental sector is going to be a significant feature of all our housing lives going forward. Okay, our housing stock, however, this is the bit I love. The housing stock has only increased, now that's the net total of stock of houses, by 8,800 houses in 5 years, 0.4% of our housing stock. In the same time, our population has gone up by 173,000. This is why we have issues about overcrowding. We are one of the few countries in the world where our household size, as we get developed, our household size has increased. Household sizes decrease in developed countries as people stay single for longer, they have fewer kids, they're better educated, better jobs, they're not having as many kids. In Ireland, our average household size has now gone from 2.73 to 2.75. That is not a healthy indicator. And it tends to have issues around overcrowding. We have an awful lot of people living in houses where there are more people than rooms, and that is not good. We have 183,000 vacant houses. Depending on your measure that you do, you're always going to have vacant houses, okay? From probate, houses for sale, for rent, people in nursing homes, all that kind of stuff. You're always going to have a proportion. Depending on what country you're in, they use a metric of between 4 and 6% of your housing stock is going to be vacant at any one time. That's fine. Using those metrics, we have somewhere between 60 to 80,000 houses above the norm that are sitting empty around the country. About 25,000 in Dublin City. We also have potential for 4,000 extra homes above the shop in Dublin City alone. In areas, we have vacancy rates, you'd be surprised, we have vacancy rates in the centre of Dublin where there's high housing demand of 16, 17, 18%. And in places like Mansion Ward B, if you do it by electoral districts, the vacancy rate is somewhere around 28.2%. That is a huge vacancy rate. Some of those vacancies are not caused by dereliction or buildings falling down. It's by investors buying houses and leaving them empty, particularly in the wealthier areas of cities. It's a common problem in Melbourne, London and everywhere else, and now starting to happen here. So that's where we are. So the bar on the right is our population, and the bar on the left, that little bar, is the amount of houses that we built. Now, I have a regular run-in with the former Minister, Simon Coveney, about the number of houses we built. And he has dug his heels in about that. And they will tell you that there were 15,000 houses completed last year. And I will tell you there weren't. And I can prove it, and he can't. The actual number of houses that were built last year was 2,975. They were houses that were built last year. Okay, if you add in extra houses, like from Ghost Estates and Nama, that had been built 5-10 years previously and finished out and reconnected to the ESB grid, because that's how we count a new house in Ireland when it's connected to the ESB grid, we can add another 4,000 to that. So we've in or around 7,000 or 8,000 houses, we'll say 7,000 houses in total completed last year. The department will say we completed 15,000. Now they must be counting every outhouse, hen house, crack house, whorehouse, whatever, to get to 15,000. We cannot do it, and we are using every indicator of direct activity, BER certs, building energy certs, revenue transactions. If we built 15,000 new houses last year, how come there was only 4,000 stamp duty transactions? Okay, so we have lots of issues with that. But what we forget to do is take away the natural rate of dereliction. Every year, a certain number of houses are going to just tipple over because they're old. Okay, and that's fine. That is part of the housing system. And in Ireland, that's about 8,000 houses a year we lose to natural obsolescence, we call it. Houses get old, whatever, fall out. That's fine. It means, though, last year, given our real and accurate rate of building, that we actually lost over 900 houses to our housing stock. We're not even building enough houses to keep going, to keep standing still. And that is a significant issue. It was interesting to hear Leo Varadkar in his first move as Taoiseach is to call for a review of Rebuilding Ireland. Rebuilding Ireland is based on false numbers. And that I have to say, hat off to him. If he does that, I would be very pleased, because it needs a serious overhaul. So that's where we're at. We're losing houses. Our target is 25,000 houses by 2021. When I challenged the former minister on this, he was so bullish, he brought that target forward to 2019. Right? We're building, 3,000 houses a year. This is just not going to happen. So it's a long game. We're looking at 10 years before we get it back on our feet in terms of house building. 10 years. What are people going to do? What are the generation behind me going to do in those 10 years when there's nothing for them out there to buy? So, local authority housing, you'll also get told that there are huge numbers of houses being provided in the local authority housing system. And actually last year we built 652. The impression from the publicity material would be about 8,000. The reality is 652. Part 5 housing that we delivered, which is the 10%, any development over 10 units, the developer must offer 10% of that to the local authority. The target of that is 4,700 units by 2021. Last year, we got 35 units out of that. In the first quarter of this year in Dublin, we got 2. Okay, so these targets are just nonsensical. And that part of the reason there is because we're relying on the private market to deliver those houses. If there's no private market house building going on, there's no Part 5 delivery. The councils, so I'm trying to break down the 652. Councils themselves built 204 units, AHBs about 413. The overall target from Rebuilding Ireland is 47,000 units, and of which most 26,000 are going to come from the private rental sector, let's be honest here, and 21,000 are due to be builds. Last year we built 652. This is why Rebuilding Ireland needs to be shaken to the core and rebuilt. So these are the numbers that you will see, and all those ones in the red box actually come from either existing stock or refurbishing existing stock, or from the private rental sector, the RAS, HAP, leasing, and then acquisition. Oh my God. Okay. Increasing supply does not bring down house prices. House price leads supply. When builders see prices going up, they start building. That's really what happens. People are getting older when they buy houses. Under 35s are down now to 37% of all households, where they used to be 41%, and more people rent than own up to the age of 35. That used to be 26 back in 1991. The average age to buy a house is 34, getting older. The average age to get married is 35, also getting older. But that's for socio-economic reasons, which is fine. Now, the labour market, what I see in the labour market, and I want you to kind of mash this in with what I've talked about, the housing stock. The housing market, a reflection of our labour market. And what I see is a rise of a class of workers who earn too much money for state subsidies, but will struggle, but not enough to buy their own home. And these people are kind of stuck in the middle. I'm roughly guessing an income of around 36 to 60,000 household income a year. They're going to be in trouble. There's a dated attitude to mortgage risk, in particular by banks. If you rock up to the Ulster Bank, or one of the banks, I won't name Ulster Bank, one of the banks, and you are on 3-month contracts as a journalist, and you do okay, but you happen to be on contract, you will struggle to get a mortgage. And they seem reluctant to introduce things like 11-month mortgages, where you can miss a payment and not have a penalty just while you're changing job or changing contract. So that is also a problem. You have smaller household sizes. Our marital separation rate is about just under 10%, which means people can no longer turn to their families. Smaller household size, you've got smaller resources, and it's increasingly difficult to turn back to your family to look for help in terms of deposit, for example, to buy somewhere. In the next couple of years, about nearly 2/3 of all households in Dublin will be 1 and 2 person. That's going to have affordability issues. If you don't own your own home, as we heard earlier on, you don't accumulate wealth. 450 billion euro worth of our wealth is tied up in property. Half our national wealth is tied up in property. So how does asset-based welfare, this system, work if nobody has assets? Where do you get the welfare from if nobody has an asset? This is a real problem. And I think limited mobility and downward mobility is going to be an issue, which is a really hard thing to say, but I think the idea of people moving down the social scale is going to be a reality. Okay, the housing inequalities, I'm getting there, David. The housing inequalities, I see 3 areas. Access to accommodation is going to be a big one, particularly with continued reliance on the private sector without state intervention in the construction of social and actually defining affordable housing. It's left up to each authority to define it, and they're all coming up with various different definitions, none of which are any good. Waiting list, there's discrimination in the sector, as we heard earlier on. There's 2.5 times more entire units available on Airbnb than there is to rent in the city, and we have the whole light touch regulation system. This is all going to limit access to housing. After access, if you do get a house, then there's affordability issues. Local authorities are one of the main drivers of rent increases and house price increases in cities, as are followed then by investors. There's no definition of what affordable means. It's up to each local authority, so there's limited consistency. There's no plan for affordable ownership, only cost rental. There's no supply, and investor activity means house prices are going to rise. People stay longer in the private rental sector. Rents therefore rise. More investors in, house prices go up again. At the same time as we bring in a capital gains tax exemption if you hold on to land or buildings for 7 years. So you don't have to do anything. You'll escape the capital gains tax by not building. And that is a contradictory kind of a policy. So there's no incentive to build. There's limited or no meaningful tax really on vacant site, and there's no tax on empty properties. And then finally, once you're in your accommodation, there's issues around security. There's no constitutional right to housing. Constitutional right to housing would not give everybody a house, but it would put a floor on what policies can be brought in. And there's limited security of tenure. Lease length is totally irrelevant in the face of Section 34 of the Act, where you can be turfed out if your landlord wants the property for a family member. HAP is insecure, there's poor standards, all that kind of stuff, no deposit protection scheme. So there's 3 issues of serious problems to do with our housing system for the cohort that are coming who might never own their own home. So this has issues around home ownership, social housing and other issues. We don't know what's going to go on. Policy responses have been very weak so far. They've been responsive. Policy formation based on what the CIF tell them to do and some other large developers. Predictable policies, nothing imaginative. Refusal to accept the scale of the problem. Politically, housing has been the dog that doesn't bark. I do think in the next election housing is going to be something really seriously. You look at in the UK, this is the last slide, you look at the UK and the difference between Tory and Labour voters, homeowners 52% Tory, 32% Labour, renters 52% Labour, 31% Tory. It is going to be a huge issue, I think, politically coming down for the next government, and thank God at last housing will get the political weight that it needs, rather than arguing over who needs a minister from the West and who needs a minister from Dublin. Okay, thank you very much.